Welcome to Out of Bounds Read, the official podcast of the Common Weakness Enumeration Program. In this podcast, we'll talk with CWE program partners and members of the broader cybersecurity community about common weaknesses in software and hardware, the vulnerabilities they cause, how to reduce them, and how using CWE can help make products more secure by design. Welcome to another episode of the Out of Bounds Read podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the top 25. The top 25 list and supplemental information is available on the CWE website and can be accessed in the top right corner of any page on the site. There's a variety of resources in addition to the list itself, including some insights and methodology, as well as information from previous years in the archive. There's lots of awareness of the top 25, and also there's lots of questions in how it's made, what it means. But before we dive into all that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for this podcast today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Connor. Over to you.
Thanks, Alec. Hey, everyone. My name is Connor Mullaly. I am the CWE Top 25 Task Lead. I'm very passionate about root cause mapping, and I've actually had the pleasure of coordinating directly with a lot of CNAs throughout the Top 25 process. Alongside that, I also do a lot of content development for the CWE program, and I also do secure code reviews through MITRE, which I'm very passionate about as well. So I'm glad to be here talking about this.
Great to have you. And Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Alec. Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Christey Coley. I was the co-founder of CWE back in around 2005 or so. A little bit earlier than that, I did something called CVE that people might have heard of. I'm very passionate about vulnerabilities and vulnerability analysis, and trying to get our industry to the point where we are making new mistakes instead of a lot of the same old mistakes that then allow attackers to exploit vulnerabilities in our software. So I'm glad to be here talking about the top 25.
Great to be with both of you guys. So as we get started here, Connor, could you start by sort of explaining what the top 25 is for any listeners who are unfamiliar and why it's such a critical resource for cybersecurity professionals?
Yeah, sure. So CWE is a catalog of a wide variety of software weaknesses, but the top 25 list highlights the most severe and prevalent weaknesses that are associated with public CVE records over a year period. So for this 2025, this was June 2024 to June 2025. And the way we go about calculating this list, it's in two parts. So the first part is about ensuring that all of the CWE mappings for the CVE records are as accurate and precise as possible. And then the second part is the actual calculation of the ranked list. In the last 2 years, we've actually started a targeted outreach to the CNAs that assign these CVE records and hopefully are assigning CWE mappings. We invite them to revisit an identified subset of their mappings before we do the final calculation to try to see if there's maybe a better mapping that they could be using, or assigning a mapping that might be slightly different but be slightly more correct. The list is finally calculated once we've arrived at these, more precise mappings using two metrics. So we talk about severity, which is the average CVSS score for the vulnerabilities associated with these CWEs, and also prevalence, which is the number of times a CVE record maps to a particular CVE. And there's some formulas that we use to, combine these metrics and arrive at a final score, and that's what ranks this list. And talking about importance to the cybersecurity community, CWE is a huge corpus with over 1,000 entries, and it can really be a tall task for developers or anyone that's trying to get familiar with CWE on where to start. So I think the top 25 list, being 25 CWEs, provides a really good starting point for people that are trying to get familiar with CWE, kind of reading through those, getting their feet wet. Or anyone that just wants to kind of look through the corpus. But it can also aid organizations with, prioritizing detection techniques for important software weaknesses and help prevent these severe and prevalent weaknesses associated with vulnerabilities before the vulnerabilities actually happen.
That's great. So you talked about sort of as a microcosm or a distillation of the entire corpus. Can you say a little bit more about, as it's representing sort of a distillation of the entire corpus, what does it really represent for the broader ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think the list is really useful for trend analysis in terms of what weaknesses we're seeing across the scope of all CVEs. Like I kind of alluded to prior, it can help aid with those sort of prioritization decisions for what weaknesses should be really looked at by organizations. But talking about CNAs, I think it's also really useful to see trends in what weaknesses CNAs are actually mapping to. We can see recurring weaknesses that get mapped to year after year. Something that we have known mitigations for, such as cross-site scripting, SQL injection, out of bounds write. These are things that pop up year after year, and CNAs are still mapping to these. It also can show us, in terms of how well CNAs are mapping to CWEs. So we have the actual weaknesses that we're looking at it, themselves, but our CNAs mapping to discouraged CWEs or abstract classes. And what we can see is that there still are some discouraged CWEs being mapped to, but in general, I think CNAs are trending in a good direction in terms of how they're mapping and how many mappings they're doing. In 2025, we actually saw, I think it was 67% of the CVE records in our data set had a CWE mapping assigned by the CNA. And that's actually an increase of 14% from 2024. I think a lot of that has to do with our targeted outreach. And although we see this improvement, like I said before, there are still some things that CNAs can be improving on, such as not mapping to discouraged CWEs, really looking at the mapping notes for CWEs, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. But I think root cause mapping at scale is something that's still maturing, but it's good to see that CNAs are going in a good direction.
Thanks, Connor. Yeah, so you made an interesting point in that a lot of this data now is being provided by those closest to the products themselves, right? CNAs or CVE numbering authorities who have a particular scope that's authorized by the CVE program to assign and publish CVE IDs and CVE records, respectively. Given that the top 25 list reflects how CNAs are mapping CWEs to CVEs, Steve, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit initially, and maybe Connor, your thoughts as well. Are there any areas in particular that CNAs seem to get wrong or sort of misinterpret about CWE fairly often? Are there any things that we can talk about there?
Yes, so I think one general pattern that we see with a lot of CNAs is to map to CWEs that are fairly high level when better matches might be available for them at a lower level to be more specific. CWE is laid out in a hierarchical scheme with more or less 4 different kinds of layers, where at the top layer is the most abstract, which are pillars, followed by high-level classes, and then bases and variants. And what we want CNAs to do in general is to map to bases or variants, because that's more specific and that's more actionable, and it's easier, just better for us to track from a trend analysis perspective. But what we've seen is that many CNAs will map to higher level, more general classes or even pillars sometimes when a lower level CWE is available. So as part of the top 25 work, we pull out for each CNA, we pull out the CVE records that map to those generally higher level CWEs. And there's a variety of CWEs that we think are not exactly problematic, but where CNAs could do a better job. So, for example, we have CWE 787, which is for an out of bounds write, and that's pretty specific. But we have a lot of variants and lower level CWEs underneath there, underneath that particular CWE, and people will often just choose the more general CWE 787 for out of bounds write. Other areas such as access control have a lot of lower level CWEs, and yet we've seen many CNAs have a tendency to use just a more general CWE that's really related to access control, as opposed to the different kinds of mechanisms related to access control that are more specific, such as authorization, authentication, assignment of permissions, assignment of privileges to users, and so on. So we've captured the commonly misused CWEs and use those to provide feedback to the CNAs for their own CVE records. And then we've been lucky enough to get a lot of responses from many different CNAs offering corrections, which generally are to use lower level mappings. As Connor had touched on before, we have these mapping notes, this notion of mapping usage, which for every single CWE we have in the corpus suggests whether a CWE might be appropriate to use for mapping or not. And we have many CWEs that we discourage for mapping, typically because they're very high level and they have more specific children. And then in other cases, they can just be confused or too easily used or too easily misused by the CNAs. So in our interactions with CNAs through the top 25 work, we've realized and we've heard back from CNAs that often they find it to be very helpful to them what we've sent to them in terms of the reports for CVEs that look like they might have better CWEs associated with them. Another area that I haven't touched on yet is we also have a crude keyword matcher that goes and actually looks at the CVE descriptions and looks for phrases that indicate certain weaknesses. Typically, that might be at a lower level of abstraction than what the CNA has used. So, for example, a CNA might map to CWE 787 out of bounds right, but if we see a phrase like heap-based buffer overflow, well, that's more specific than out of bounds right. And so we suggest those kinds of mappings as well to the CNAs. So we've learned a lot from the CNAs. We've heard from the CNAs themselves on a pretty frequent basis that they've learned and will improve their mappings in the future. And so our hope is that we'll ultimately be able to educate, all CNAs out there and other CWE users just in general to become better at their mappings, to become more specific.
So you mentioned too, Steve, it makes me think that if there's a change in how CNAs are mapping, and we're seeing perhaps a change that's a positive change in sort of getting towards more precise or more actionable CWE mappings by CNAs, it must have an effect trend-wise looking across the top 25 between one year to the next. I know that many times in the past, there's been an effort to try and normalize some of the data that comes in, Connor, in terms of that. Can you talk a little bit about this year? And was that the same where we sort of try and roll up or normalize some of the CNA provided mappings or even mappings coming from third parties downstream in order to calculate the top 25?
Yeah, I think this is a good time to talk about that. And, we obviously value comparing the top 25 list year after year and having it be similar to be able to compare. In years past, what we've done is we have done a roll-up or normalization to make sure that all the CWE mappings fall into what is called View 1003. And this is a subset of CWEs that are identified for their use in root cause mapping. And this has been used by NVD in the past. They value that a smaller subset of CWEs is easier for their analysts to map to. And that's what we've used in the past. We've ensured that all the mappings fall into that view. This year we went with a different approach and we've actually strayed away from that view. We think it's best to map to the whole corpus. You can get very specific doing it that way. There's a lot of nuanced CWEs that you can map to that might not be in that view. So we've chosen to not normalize this year. This is a great representation of exactly what CNAs are mapping to without any kind of normalization. So there are some differences that you'll see. I think the introduction of CWE 284, which is for improper access control, that's a pillar that's been introduced into the list this year that hasn't been in the list before. simply because it wasn't in View 1003. So in the past, we would just remove those mappings entirely because there's no actionable parent to that we can roll up to. So there are some differences. We're seeing the introduction of stack-based buffer overflow and heap-based buffer overflow. And those are the children to outer bounds right. So you'll see outer bounds right kind of drop a little bit, and those two get introduced. So we're seeing a spread of those buffer-related weaknesses kind of getting more spread out than in the past if it would just be to out of bounds right. So there are definitely some differences here, but I think it's really valuable to see exactly what CNAs are mapping to and what those specific weaknesses are rather than that roll up.
Great. Connor, can you talk a little bit about the outreach that the CWE team did this year, similar to last year, but maybe a little bit different in terms of helping CNAs in terms of the data mapping review that they do, the data quality review, and the recommendations that they give back in terms of the mappings that go into the top 25 calculation?
Yeah, so the same as last year, we reached out to CNAs with a subset of their CVE records that we wanted them to look at and take another review of. And the way we did this is utilizing the keyword matcher that Steve talked about previously to identify those CVE records, and then we also identified CVE records that had mappings to higher level classes or pillars. And what's different is, last year we heard a lot of feedback from CNAs saying, well, you identified these mappings that we had to high level classes, but there's no guidance or suggestions for where we should go. So it was hard to work from. So this year we incorporated the use of an LLM to give mapping suggestions for those higher level classes or pillars based on what it saw in the CV descriptions. And the LLM had its uses, it had its downfalls. I think sometimes it was a little bit overconfident in some of the mappings it was trying to force, especially in scenarios of low or insufficient info. But overall, I think it was helpful in giving CNAs a starting point for maybe some mapping suggestions that they could think about rather than just no suggestions at all. And I think we're working to develop this capability further and try to refine this LLM and how it could be useful in the future as we continue to engage with CNAs.
So, Steve, historically, the top 25 has changed in different ways in its methodology and how it ranks weaknesses. One of the things that we've heard a common trend in vulnerability management over the last year and certainly in recent months too has been prioritizing exploitability and known exploitation as a means to really focus on first vulnerabilities that are in those categories. Does the CWE Top 25 currently incorporate exploitability into the rankings? Can you talk a little bit about that now and maybe what might be coming?
Sure. So the top 25 really is just the fundamental nature of how the top 25 has been generated. Really just takes into account CVSS scores and the frequency, how many CWEs are matched to within the CVE corpus. And but CVSS scores don't really include notions of real world exploitability, whether a particular CVE has been exploited or not. But what we do have is we have the KEV top 10, the known exploitable vulnerabilities top 10. And what we do is we run the same kind of scoring methodology, but we apply the scoring methodology only to CVEs that were published within CISA's KEV list. And so that helps to give us some prioritization of weaknesses based on known exploitation. So that's something that we've had available for the last couple of years and will continue to offer.
Great. So given the fact that exploitability is extremely important, what are the reasons to not just use the KEV list as the main list?
Well, in short, the KEV list, relatively speaking, is pretty small. We don't actually have a lot of exploitability data. For example, in our KEV data set that we used for 2025, only 6 weaknesses in that data set actually affected 10 CVEs or more. And that seems like a really low number to really base broad decisions on. And because we are also working with a pretty narrow data set, the rankings can vary widely, even if your count is just different by one. And so the rankings become less apparent or less clear, less stable. Also, even though the KEV data set is pretty small, we still have 70 unique CWEs in it. And we've even observed that some KEVs don't even have enough information to map to a CWE in the first place. So we have this limitation of maybe we don't have a lot of data that's out there. There are other potential sources of exploitability data and potential collaborations we could do with the broader community to learn more about that. But we haven't done that so far anyway. Another thing is that it's not entirely clear how well we are doing as an industry in terms of being able to detect exploitation of specific kinds of weaknesses. So, for example, the use of hard-coded credentials, that just shows up as like a legitimate regular login. Someone's logging in using a credential and they're succeeding. There's no password cracking. There's nothing like that. Just looks like a legitimate activity. As a different example, I suspect that cross-site request forgery, CSRF, those attacks against CSRF weaknesses really just cause a victim to make a legitimate request that the victim is actually authorized to do. So it's not something that would automatically generate some kind of a log that would say something bad had happened. So one thing I'm not sure about is whether all weaknesses is easily detectable using current methodologies for even determining exploitation. Now, all that said, we're definitely interested in hearing from the community about how we can really best capture usable exploitability information and then potentially integrate it into future work in the top 25 itself, because we do recognize the importance of exploitability for people to really prioritize what kinds of weaknesses they really want to get rid of first.
Yeah, that sounds like a really promising opportunity to engage the community in this space. I know there's a lot of researchers and capabilities out there emphasizing exploitability. It would be really valuable to potentially integrate those. So be on the lookout. And if you're interested in offering or contributing to this, please do let us know. With that in mind, we have these two lists to look at. What would you guys say? How do you recommend that the community engage with the top 25 and the KEV lists as two separate lists? How do you recommend that they consider these things in their efforts around vulnerability management?
Yeah, I can take on this one. I think the two lists serve distinct purposes. I think certain vendors might want to consider the KEV list more if they consider their product more front-facing. Maybe vendors that develop edge devices should take into account the KEV list a little more. I know the edge devices are commonly exploited. But I think we really need to look at the top 25 list more heavily than the KEV list for a lot of the reasons that Steve had mentioned. But I think it's good to start thinking about exploitability and using that in conjunction with the top 25 list. Maybe what types of weaknesses should be prioritized a little bit more based on their rank in our KEV top 10 list. We're seeing things like OS command injection actually came in at first for the KEV list, where it actually ranked 9th in the top 25 list. So maybe there needs to be a little bit more consideration for that. And then, maybe things like cross-site scripting or SQL injection and CSRF, like Steve mentioned, while those appear really high in the top 25 list, maybe it's not quite as important as some of these injection weaknesses that rank higher in the KEV list. But obviously, with the minimal data set, it's hard to make those broad leaps and judgments. But I think it's good to have these two lists and letting the community decide what's important to them. And we're hoping to see, not that more vulnerabilities get exploited, but maybe there will be an increase in KEV data for us to work with and maybe draw some better conclusions in the future.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, drawing better conclusions in the future is definitely something that I think we all want to do with this data, and that's really the point of all these lists that we provide. As we wrap up today, do you guys have any recommendations for someone who's looking to be more effective at root cause mapping?
Yeah, the CWE website, we do have root cause mapping guidance on there. If you go from the top banner, you can go down and find the root cause mapping guidance document, which basically gives an overview of what root cause mapping is, the vulnerability mindset versus a weakness mindset, and how that might be different. It gives a good starting point for some tips as well about how to go about doing the actual mapping and what tools to use. So we always recommend that if someone is going to be doing root cause mapping, that they go and read that guidance document just to get started. We're looking to improve and bolster that guidance with maybe more examples and different types of activities in the future. So stay on the lookout for that. I think it's important as well that people doing root cause mapping really utilize the mapping notes and mapping usage that we've talked about previously. That has a lot of good information. And I think before you say, yep, I'm going to choose this CWE, you really need to consult those mapping notes because it could give you some insight that you might not have considered previously. And obviously, we want to avoid using discouraged or prohibited CWEs based on those mapping notes. In the future, we're considering maybe introducing a CWE chatbot that could aid people doing root cause mapping and be able to ask live kinds of questions to that. So that might be a capability in the future that we're looking into. But ultimately, I think people doing root cause mapping need to, as I talked about prior, separate the vulnerability mindset from a weakness mindset. We're really trying to understand why a vulnerability happened. And we're not as much interested for root cause mapping in what the result of the vulnerability is. We really want to see the root cause. And a lot of times people doing mappings can conflate that technical impact with what is actually the root cause weakness, and there can be some mismappings there. So really just trying to identify the root cause. That's really the main tip that I would give.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, the impact is always important, but something that a lot of people focus on. So focusing on the weakness is something we all have to flex our muscles on or build our muscles on, I think. Steve, do you have any last minute quick tips for anybody?
I think Connor did a great job covering a variety of good tips. Really getting to the root cause requires asking why. If you have something that is writing out of bounds in a buffer, why is that happening? What is the mistake that's being made there? So there's potentially a series of questions that can really lead you to the root cause. And I think another thing to keep in mind is don't necessarily stop looking once you found a CWE that matches what you're thinking of. We often have fairly high level CWEs that are sort of in the area, but we have a lot more specific CWEs as well. And so that's where looking at things such as the mapping notes to see whether a CWE is discouraged. If it's discouraged, maybe it has a number of different children that are more specific, that are more likely to be able to be used, so that we then have better, lower level, more detailed, more specific information that is therefore also more actionable. So yes, quite a few tips there about improving the mapping quality, and the mapping quality really helps everyone. It helps us on the industry in an industry-wide perspective to really get a sense of how trends are going. But then CNAs, especially vendors, can also understand what their specific limitations are. Where are they continually, making certain kinds of errors? Can they address that with with better tooling for specific CWEs, or do they need to increase their training in some areas? So getting better mappings just means better vulnerability information for everybody.
That's great. And better information getting to those developers is so important in stopping this proliferation. So I really appreciate your guys' time. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Steve. For all our listeners, thank you for your time. Remember that if you are curious about this, the top 25 is easily accessible from the CWE website. In the top right corner, you can click on the icon that says top 25, and you can find not only the list, but some of the key insights and methodology information where you can really dive into the details. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Steve. And see you next time. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Out of Bounds Read podcast. If you like what you heard, please let us know. Visit us on our website at cwe.mitre.org to learn more about the program and how to get involved, submit content ideas for review, or find out where to follow us on social media. We'll see you next time.